I don't remember what exactly drew me to that house, but I found myself there every time I needed a quiet place to think. It was an old Victorian, painted a deep shade of green, almost black, with shutters hanging by a single hinge and a roof that looked like it might cave in at any moment. It was the last house on Hillview Road, a dead-end street that seemed to die in the shadow of its looming presence. The locals called it the McAllister House, named after the family that disappeared from it decades ago. Most people avoided it, whispering stories of ghosts and curses. I'd heard them all before, but they felt more like tales to scare kids into behaving than real warnings. To me, the house was just abandoned, a relic of the past, left to decay like everything else in this dying town. I felt a kind of kinship with it, both of us out of place, forgotten. It started as a whim. One evening, after a particularly rough day at work, I drove up Hillview Road, parked my car at the edge of the driveway, and just stared at it. The sun was setting behind it, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out and pull me in. I got out of the car, walked up the cracked stone path, and stood on the porch. The wood creaked under my weight, the sound echoing in the stillness. My hand hesitated on the rusted doorknob, but curiosity won out, and I turned it. The door swung open with a groan, and I stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the smell of mildew and dust. I could barely see anything in the dim light filtering through the grimy windows. I felt for a switch on the wall, but it was dead. Just as well, I thought. Electricity would have felt out of place here, an intruder in a house that seemed to belong to another time. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a grand staircase in front of me, its banister coated in cobwebs. To my left, a living room, the furniture covered in white sheets like shrouds. To my right, a hallway leading to the back of the house, its ends swallowed by shadows. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but it wasn't fear. It was anticipation. I walked through the living room, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. I pulled a sheet off the nearest piece of furniture and found a grand piano, its keys yellowed and warped. I touched one, and it let out a dull, discordant note that seemed to linger in the air longer than it should have. I smiled to myself. This place was a time capsule, a forgotten piece of history. I spent hours there that first night, exploring every room, every corner. I found old photographs, books, and clothes still hanging in the closets. It was as if the McAllisters had just stepped out for a moment and never returned. The house was alive with their presence, their memories seeping into the walls. By the time I left, it was past midnight, but I felt oddly at peace. For once, I wasn't thinking about my dead-end job or my empty apartment. My mind was filled with the house, its secrets. At first, it was once a week, then twice. Soon, I was there almost every evening, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. I'd bring a flashlight, some snacks, and a notebook, jotting down my thoughts as I explored. I even found an old armchair in one of the bedrooms and dragged it to the front parlor, setting up a kind of base camp. I'd sit there for hours, listening to the house creak and groan around me, feeling its presence wrap around me like a blanket. That's when the dreams started. They were vague at first, fleeting images of the house, its hallways stretching out endlessly before me. But they grew more vivid, more detailed. I'd find myself standing in the living room, the sheets pulled off the furniture, the piano playing a soft, haunting melody. I could see shadows moving at the edge of my vision, hear whispers that I couldn't quite make out. One night, I dreamed I was in the upstairs hallway, standing in front of a door I didn't recognize. It was at the end of the hall, just past the last bedroom. In the dream, I reached for the knob, but my hand stopped inches away. I could hear something behind the door, a faint scratching sound, like nails on wood. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The next evening, I returned to the house, determined to find that door. I climbed the stairs, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. I reached the end of the hallway and nothing, just the plain wall where the door had been in my dream. I felt a wave of disappointment, mixed with relief. It was just a dream, I told myself. This house had a way of getting under your skin. I held my breath, straining to listen. There it was again, like nails on wood. I took a step closer, pressing my ear to the wall. The sound was clearer now, more insistent. I felt a chill run down my spine. For the first time, the house felt wrong, like I was intruding on something, disturbing something that should have been left alone. I stumbled back, almost dropping my flashlight. The scratching stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. I turned and ran down the stairs, out the front door, and didn't stop until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood there, dark and silent, but I could have sworn I saw a light flicker in one of the upstairs windows. I didn't go back for a few days, telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the stories get to me. But the dreams didn't stop. Every night, I'd find myself in that hallway, standing in front of that door, the scratching sound growing louder, more frantic. I knew I had to go back. I had to find that door, had to know what was behind it. I just didn't know that once I opened it, there would be no turning back. The itch to return to the McAllister house gnawed at me like a mosquito bite. No matter how much I tried to distract myself with work or television, thoughts of the house, and more specifically that hidden door, kept intruding. I'd be sitting at my desk, staring at my computer screen, but my mind was still wandering the hallways of that darkened house, trying to make sense of the scratching sounds. It was becoming a compulsion. By the time I returned, the sun was already dipping low in the sky. Shadows stretched long and thin, and a chill had settled in the air. I parked at the end of the driveway and sat in my car for a moment, staring at the house. It looked even more foreboding than I remembered, its dark windows like eyes watching me. I thought about leaving, but I knew that if I did, I'd only be back again tomorrow. The house had me under its spell. The door groaned as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the empty halls. I stood in the foyer, taking a deep breath, inhaling the familiar scent of dust and decay. I made my way up the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath my feet a small betrayal of my presence. The upstairs hallway stretched before me, a narrow tunnel of shadows. I moved slowly, running my hand along the wall, feeling for any hidden seam or imperfection. Halfway down the hall, I felt it. A slight dip, almost imperceptible. I shone my flashlight on the wall and saw the faint outline of a doorframe. My heart leaped into my throat. It had been here all along, hidden just out of sight. My fingers traced the edges of the door, searching for a knob or handle, but there was nothing, just smooth, cold wood. I pressed my ear to the door. The scratching was louder now, more frantic. It wasn't the kind of noise a mouse or rat would make. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. This was no ordinary door. This door was hiding something or someone. I pulled my multi-tool from my pocket, prying at the edges of the door, searching for a way in. The wood groaned under the pressure, and I felt the door give just a fraction. I pressed harder, feeling a thrill of excitement. The door popped open with a soft click, swinging inward on creaky hinges. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase, descending into darkness. A cold draft wafted up from the depths, carrying with it a faint, metallic odor. I hesitated, my hand tightening on the flashlight. I knew I should turn back, leave the house and never come back. But something compelled me forward. I had to know. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The air grew colder with each step, and the metallic scent grew stronger, like rust and decay. At the bottom of the stairs was a narrow hallway, its walls lined with faded, peeling wallpaper. The scratching sound was louder now, coming from behind a door at the end of the hall. I approached the door, my heart pounding. It was old, heavy, with rusted hinges and a tarnished brass handle. I reached out, my hand trembling, and turned the knob. The door swung open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was a wooden chair, and in the chair was a man. He was slumped forward, his head hanging down, dark hair obscuring his face. His hands were tied behind the chair with thick, frayed ropes, his wrists raw and bloody. His clothes were tattered and stained, hanging off his thin frame like rags. The scratching sound was coming from him, his fingers clawing weakly at the wood of the chair. I gasped, stumbling back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The man's head jerked up, and he looked at me, his eyes wide and wild, filled with a desperate hunger. His mouth moved, lips cracking and bleeding as he tried to form words, but no sound came out. For a moment, we just stared at each other, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, he said, "Help me." I rushed forward, fumbling with the knots that bound his wrists. The rope was thick and rough, cutting into my hands as I worked to free him. As soon as his hands were loose, he slumped forward, nearly falling out of the chair. I caught him, his body cold and clammy. He was shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice sounding strange in the silence. He nodded weakly, and I helped him to his feet, half carrying him up the stairs. He was lighter than I expected, his body thin and frail, like he hadn't eaten in days. We reached the top of the stairs and I paused, listening. The house was silent, the only sound the man's labored breathing. We made our way down the hallway, my flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. We reached the foyer, and I pushed the front door open, the hinges screeching in protest. We stumbled out onto the porch, the cold night air biting into my skin. I looked around, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the street was empty, the houses dark and silent. "Who did this to you?" I asked, turning to the man. He was leaning against the porch railing, his eyes closed, his breathing slowing. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with fear. They won't let me go," he whispered, his voice cracking. "They'll come for me. For us." A chill ran down my spine, and I looked back at the house. It loomed over us, dark and silent, its windows like empty eyes. I felt a wave of unease, like we were being watched. "We need to get you to a hospital," I said, pulling out my phone to call for help. But before I could dial, the man grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "No hospitals," he said, his voice urgent. "They'll find me. We need to leave. Now." I slipped my phone back into my pocket. "Okay," I said. "Let's get out of here." I helped him down the steps, glancing back at the house one last time. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move in one of the upstairs windows, but when I blinked, it was gone. I shook my head, leading the man to my car. We climbed in, and I started the engine, the car rumbling to life. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood silent, dark, and empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, following us. I kept checking the mirror, expecting to see headlights, a figure, something, but the road behind us was empty. We drove in silence, the man slumped in the passenger seat, his eyes half closed. I didn't know where we were going, only that we needed to get away from that house. The further we drove, the more the tension in my chest eased, the grip of the house loosening. But as we reached the edge of town, the man turned to me, his eyes wide with fear. "They're here," he whispered, his voice trembling. I glanced in the mirror, my heart skipping a beat. Headlights appeared behind us, bright and blinding, speeding toward us. I hit the gas, the engine roaring as we raced down the dark, empty road. The headlights gained on us, and I could see the outline of a large, dark car, its windows tinted, faceless. "They won't stop," the man said, his voice breaking. "They'll never stop." I didn't know who they were or why they wanted him. But as the car behind us grew closer, its headlights filling the car with blinding light, one thought kept running through my mind. We have to get out alive. The blinding headlights behind us were so close now that they filled the car with a harsh, white light. My heart was racing, adrenaline flooding my veins. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white, and floored the accelerator. The engine roared in response, but the car chasing us only seemed to grow closer. "Hold on," I shouted to the man beside me. He didn't respond, his eyes wide with fear, his breathing shallow and quick. I glanced at him, his face pale and drawn, before focusing back on the road ahead. We were on the old highway that ran through the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods on either side. The road was narrow and winding, and I knew I had to keep my speed up if we were going to lose them. But every time I looked in the rearview mirror, the headlights were right there, gaining on us. I didn't know who was driving that car or why they were after us, but the fear in the man's eyes told me everything I needed to know. We were in danger. Real danger. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. The car behind us surged forward, bumping into our rear bumper. The jolt made me swerve, tires screeching as I fought to keep control. I gritted my teeth, cursing under my breath, and tried to put more distance between us. "There's a turnoff up ahead," the man said suddenly, his voice weak but urgent. "Left. Take the left. It leads to the old quarry." I didn't know if heading to the quarry was a good idea, but staying on the road was clearly worse. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me, and kept my eyes peeled for the turnoff. The trees whipped past in a blur, the dark shapes closing in around us. "There!" the man shouted, pointing to a narrow dirt path barely visible in the headlights. I yanked the wheel to the left, skidding off the asphalt and onto the rough, uneven ground. The car bounced and jolted, the wheels fighting for traction. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the headlights following us, turning down the same path. We barreled down the dirt road, branches scraping against the sides of the car, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. The path was rough, pitted with holes, and I struggled to keep the car steady. The man beside me was gripping the seat, his knuckles white, his eyes locked on the road ahead. "Keep going," he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the engine and the crunch of gravel. "It's not far now." I pressed harder on the gas, the car lurching forward. The dirt road twisted and turned, and I could barely see more than a few feet ahead. The headlights behind us were still there, but they seemed to be falling back, struggling to keep up on the uneven terrain. Finally, we broke through the trees and into a wide, open space. The ground dropped away in front of us, a sheer cliff leading down to the old quarry. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just inches from the edge. The headlights behind us disappeared, cut off by the curve of the road. We had a few precious moments to think. "We can't stay here," the man said, his voice tight with panic. "They'll find us. We need to hide." I scanned the area. The quarry was a vast, open pit, the walls steep and unforgiving. There were a few rusted-out mining buildings on the far side, and what looked like an old crane perched at the edge. I spotted a narrow path leading down into the quarry, barely more than a foot trail. "Down there," I said, pointing. "If we can get down into the pit, we might be able to find a place to hide." The man nodded, and we got out of the car, the night air cold against my skin. We moved quickly, making our way to the path. It was steep, and the loose gravel made it treacherous. I slipped a few times, catching myself on the rocks, the man stumbling beside me. The sound of an engine behind us sent a jolt of fear through me. They were coming. We reached the bottom of the quarry, and I pulled the man behind a large pile of rocks, crouching down, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The man was gasping for air, his face pale and drawn, his hands trembling. For a moment all was silent. Then, the sound of footsteps on gravel, the crunch of shoes on the loose ground. I peeked around the edge of the rocks and saw figures moving at the top of the quarry. They were silhouetted against the night sky, dark shapes shifting in the shadows. There were at least 3 of them, maybe more. "They're here," the man whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, sinking lower behind the rocks, my mind racing. What did they want? Why were they after us? The man's words echoed in my head. "They'll never stop." The figures began to move down the path, their movements slow and deliberate, scanning the area as they came. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. I knew that if they found us, it would be over. We had to stay quiet, had to wait for an opening. The man beside me shifted, his hand brushing against my arm. I turned to look at him, and he mouthed a single word, "Run!" I shook my head. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. We were trapped. Then, in the distance, I heard it, a faint rumble like the sound of an engine. I strained to listen, my heart skipping a beat. It was getting louder, coming closer. The figures at the top of the quarry seemed to hear it too, pausing, their heads turning toward the sound. The rumble grew into a roar, and I realized it was coming from the other side of the quarry. I peered around the rocks and saw a pair of headlights cresting the ridge, moving fast. The figures turned, confusion in their movements, as the vehicle sped down the steep incline, gravel spraying from its tires. It was a pickup truck, old and battered, but powerful. It barreled down the path, heading straight for the men at the top of the quarry. They scattered, shouting, diving out of the way as the truck plowed through. I felt a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we had a chance. The truck skidded to a halt near the edge of the quarry, and a figure jumped out. I squinted, trying to make out who it was. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with purpose. He was holding something in his hand, something that gleamed in the moonlight. A shotgun. He raised it, firing a shot into the air. The sound echoed through the quarry, deafening. The men scattered, diving for cover, shouting to each other. The man with the shotgun turned toward us, his eyes searching the darkness. "Come on!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We've got to get out of here." I grabbed the man beside me, pulling him to his feet. We stumbled out from behind the rocks, making our way toward the truck. The stranger fired another shot, keeping the other men at bay, as we climbed into the back of the truck. I banged on the side, signaling that we were in, and the driver gunned the engine. The truck roared to life, wheels spinning on the gravel before catching traction. We sped up the path, the headlights swinging wildly, illuminating the figures behind us. I held on to the side of the truck, my heart in my throat, as we raced toward the road. We hit the asphalt with a jolt, the truck skidding before straightening out. I glanced back and saw the figures in the quarry, shrinking into the distance, their shouts fading into the night. We were moving fast, too fast for them to catch up. For the first time since we fled the house, I felt a glimmer of hope. The man with the shotgun turned, looking back at us. His face was hard to see in the dim light, but his eyes were dark and serious. "Who are you?" I shouted over the roar of the wind. "Doesn't matter," he replied. "What matters is that you're not safe. They'll keep coming. And next time they'll bring more." I swallowed, glancing at the man beside me. He was staring at the stranger, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the noise. The stranger turned back to the road, his hands steady on the wheel. "We run," he said simply, "and we don't stop." I nodded, the reality of our situation settling over me like a heavy weight. We had escaped for now, but the danger was far from over. Whoever was after us wasn't going to give up easily. As we drove into the night, the trees closing in around us, one thought repeated in my mind. The truck tore down the narrow road, its engine roaring as we sped into the night. I clung to the side, my knuckles white, the wind whipping at my face. Beside me, the man we'd rescued was hunched over, his eyes darting between me and the stranger driving. Every bump in the road sent a jolt of pain through my already tense muscles, but the adrenaline kept me going. I had to stay focused. We had to stay alive. After what felt like hours, the truck slowed, pulling off the main road onto a smaller, dirt path. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a dense wall of trees. The stranger drove us deeper into the forest, the canopy above closing us in, swallowing the truck in shadows. Finally, he brought the truck to a stop in a small clearing, killing the engine. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice breaking the stillness. The stranger didn't answer right away. He stepped out of the truck, motioning for us to follow. We climbed out, and he led us a few paces into the trees, stopping at what looked like a small, rundown cabin. "This place has been abandoned for years," he said. turning to face us. "No one will find us here, not for a while at least." I helped the man from the house walk, supporting his weight as we made our way inside the cabin. It was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. The stranger lit an old oil lamp on the table, casting a dim, flickering light around the room. I guided the man to a chair and eased him down. He was trembling, his skin pale, eyes darting around the room as if expecting someone to jump out at him. "You said they won't stop," I said, turning to the stranger. "Who are they? And why are they after him?" The stranger sighed, leaning against the wall. In the dim light, I could see his face more clearly, sharp features, dark eyes that held a hardness to them, and a mouth set in a grim line. "They're part of a group," he said. "A cult or something like it. They believe in some kind of ancient power, something tied to that house you found him in. They use it to control people, to manipulate them. He," the stranger pointed to the man, "was supposed to be their next sacrifice." The word hung in the air, heavy and chilling. I glanced at the man, seeing the fear in his eyes, the trembling of his hands. He looked at me, desperation written all over his face. "I didn't know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was just looking for work. They hired me to help clean up the place. But then, things started happening. Strange things. Voices. Shadows. I tried to leave, but they wouldn't let me. They tied me up, said I had to stay until the ritual was complete." The stranger nodded. "You were lucky to find him when you did," he said, looking at me. "They were planning to use him to open a doorway to bring something through. Something that should stay on the other side." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean, bring something through?" I asked. "Like, a demon? Something worse," the stranger said, his voice low. "Something ancient, powerful. Something that feeds on fear, on pain." I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. This couldn't be real. It sounded like something out of a horror movie, but the fear in the stranger's eyes was real, and the man's trembling was real. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. "What do we do now?" I asked. "We can't just stay here. They'll find us." The stranger nodded. "We can't stay here forever, but we need to rest, regroup. We'll head out in the morning, try to put some distance between us and them." The man in the chair shook his head, his eyes wide. "No, no, you don't understand," he said, his voice rising. "They'll find us. They always find us. There's no escape. We'll figure something out," I said, trying to sound reassuring, though I felt anything but. "We just need to keep moving." The stranger looked at me, his expression unreadable. "He's right," he said quietly. "They have ways of finding us no matter where we go. The only way to end this is to stop them. Destroy the house. Break the connection." The idea of going back to the house sent a surge of fear through me. I shook my head. "We barely made it out alive the first time," I said. "How are we supposed to go back?" The stranger straightened, a determined look in his eyes. "I have some things in the truck," he said. "Supplies. If we're going to do this, we need to be prepared. It's the only way." I nodded, feeling a grim sense of resolve settle over me. "Okay," I said. "We'll do it. We'll end this." The man in the chair looked at us, his eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "They'll kill us. They'll kill us all." The stranger turned to him, his face hard. "We're not going to die," he said. "Not tonight." We spent the next hour gathering supplies. The stranger had a stash of weapons in the truck. Shotguns, pistols, a couple of machetes. He handed me a shotgun, showing me how to load and fire it. I took the weapon, the weight of it feeling strange in my hands. I wasn't a fighter, wasn't used to handling guns, but tonight I had no choice. As we prepared, the man we'd rescued grew more agitated. He kept glancing toward the door, his hands shaking. I tried to reassure him, but there was a look in his eyes that told me he was beyond comfort. He knew, just as I did, that this night was far from over. Finally, we were ready. The stranger led the way, carrying a shotgun in one hand, a bag of supplies slung over his shoulder. I followed, the rescued man trailing behind, his movements slow and hesitant. The night was dark, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, casting everything in shadow. We made our way back to the truck, and as we reached it, a sound stopped us in our tracks. A rustling, a crackling, like leaves crunching underfoot. I turned, peering into the darkness, my heart pounding. From the shadows, figures emerged, moving silently, surrounding us. My breath caught in my throat. There were at least half a dozen of them, their faces hidden in the dark, eyes glinting. They moved with a calm, measured purpose, as if they had all the time in the world. "They found us," the man whispered, his voice filled with despair. "They found us." The stranger raised his shotgun, aiming at the nearest figure. "Stay back," he shouted. "We're armed." The figures didn't stop. They kept moving closer, their presence suffocating, like a black tide rolling in. I lifted my own shotgun, my hands shaking, sweat beading on my forehead. "Get in the truck," the stranger barked. "Now!" We turned to run, but before we could move, a figure lunged from the darkness, tackling the man we'd rescued. He screamed, a sound filled with pure, raw terror, as they dragged him to the ground. "No!" I shouted, raising the shotgun. But the stranger grabbed my arm, yanking me back. "We can't save him," he shouted. "Get to the truck." I stumbled, my heart pounding in my ears, as the man's screams echoed in the night. The figures were on him, dragging him away, their faces still hidden, their movements smooth and unhurried. The stranger shoved me toward the truck, and I scrambled into the cab, the door slamming shut behind me. He jumped in after me, slamming his fist on the dashboard. "Drive!" he shouted. "Go, go, go!" I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, as the engine roared to life. I slammed my foot on the gas, the truck lurching forward, tearing through the trees. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figures standing in the clearing, watching us, the man's screams fading into the distance. We tore down the road, my hands tight on the wheel, the stranger beside me breathing hard. The night swallowed us, the trees blurring past. The stranger looked over at me, his face pale, his eyes grim. "We'll have to destroy the house," he said, his voice steady. "It's the only way to end this, the only way to stop them." I nodded, my throat tight. The man's screams still echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of what we were up against. As we drove into the darkness, I knew one thing for certain.
Mi mama vibratis живыми.
But I also knew that not all of us would make it out of this nightmare. The man's death was a warning, a promise of what awaited us. And as we sped toward the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were heading straight into the heart of darkness, where the real horror awaited. The road to the McAllister house seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness around us thick and oppressive. The truck's headlights cut through the night, casting long, eerie shadows that danced along the trees. The stranger sat beside me, his shotgun resting on his lap, eyes fixed on the road ahead. His face was set, determined, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the tightness around his eyes. He knew, just as I did, that this might be our last drive. We approached the house from the back road, trying to stay hidden. As we pulled up, I could see the outline of the house against the night sky, its dark shape looming over the landscape. The windows were dark, but I knew the house was alive, watching us, waiting. I killed the engine, and we sat in silence for a moment, the night pressing in around us. My heart pounded in my chest, my palms slick with sweat. I glanced at the stranger. He nodded, and we climbed out of the truck, moving as quietly as we could toward the house. We made our way around the side, staying close to the shadows. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like a mouse sneaking through a hawk's territory. Every step was slow, deliberate. The house loomed closer, and I could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me. I knew, deep down, that it was aware of us, that it had been waiting for us to return. We reached the back door, and the stranger pulled out a crowbar, prying it open with a loud creak that echoed through the night. My heart skipped a beat, and I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. but the house remained silent. We slipped inside, the darkness swallowing us whole. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the scent of mold and something else, something metallic. The smell of blood. I tightened my grip on the shotgun, trying to keep my hands from shaking. The stranger motioned for me to follow, and we moved through the kitchen, our footsteps muffled on the old, rotting floorboards. "We need to find the basement," the stranger whispered. "That's where the ritual will be. That's where we can stop this." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. We crept through the house, the only sound the faint creaking of the floor beneath us. The darkness was complete, our flashlights barely cutting through the blackness. Every shadow seemed to hide something, every corner a potential trap. We found the door to the basement at the end of a narrow hallway. It was old, the wood splintered and worn, a padlock hanging from a rusty chain. The stranger used the crowbar to break the lock, the snap echoing through the house. He pushed the door open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, a cold shiver running down my spine. The air was colder here, heavy with a sense of wrongness. The stranger started down, and I forced myself to follow, each step creaking under my weight. The basement was vast, the ceiling low, and the walls lined with shelves filled with old, dusty jars and boxes. In the center of the room was a circle, drawn in what looked like dried blood, strange symbols etched into the concrete. Candles were set around the circle, their flames flickering, casting long shadows. I heard it then, a faint whispering, like voices speaking just out of earshot. I turned, looking around the room, my heart racing. The stranger moved to the center of the circle, looking down at the symbols. "We need to destroy this," he said. "Break the circle, burn everything." He pulled a can of gasoline from his bag, tossing it to me. Caught it, my hands shaking. As he began to pour a line of gasoline around the circle, I moved to the shelves, dousing everything. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, the shadows in the room seeming to shift and move. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room, snuffing out the candles. The basement was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from our flashlights. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. "Did you feel that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The stranger nodded, his face pale. "They know we're here," he said. "We need to hurry." I grabbed the matches from his bag, striking one. The small flame flickered in the darkness, and I moved to the line of gasoline. Before I could light it, a voice rang out, loud and commanding, echoing off the walls. "You cannot stop this." I froze, the match trembling in my hand. The voice was coming from everywhere and nowhere, deep and resonant, filled with malice. The shadows around us seemed to thicken, closing in. "You cannot stop what has already begun," the voice said. "The doorway is open. The sacrifice has been made." I turned to the stranger, my eyes wide. "What does it mean?" I asked. "What sacrifice?" He looked at me, his face grim. "The man," he said. "The one we tried to save. They used him." My blood ran cold. The man's screams echoed in my mind, his terror, his pleading. He had been begging us to leave him, to save ourselves. The ritual was already complete. "We need to get out of here," I said, panic rising in my voice. "We need to leave now." The stranger shook his head. "It's too late," he said. "There's only one way to end this." Before I could react, he stepped into the center of the circle, his eyes locking onto mine. He held the match up, his expression calm but determined. "What are you doing?" I shouted, panic flooding my veins. "It needs a life," he said, his voice steady. "A willing sacrifice to close the door. It's the only way." "No!" I screamed, realizing what he meant. "There has to be another way." The stranger shook his head. "Go," he said. "Get out of here. Tell people what happened so it never happens again." He dropped the match. It hit the gasoline, and flames erupted around him, racing toward the circle. The fire roared to life, swallowing him in an instant. I stood there, frozen, as the flames danced around him, his face serene, accepting. The flames roared, casting wild shadows on the walls, the heat pushing me back. The whispering rose to a crescendo, a cacophony of voices, screaming, pleading, then suddenly falling silent. The room shook, a deep, rumbling sound like the earth itself was tearing apart. The air grew cold, the flames roaring higher. Then, in a flash, everything stopped. Silence. The flames vanished. The circle burned away, the basement empty except for the smell of smoke and ash. The stranger was gone. Nothing left of him but a dark stain on the floor. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, my mind reeling. I had to get out, had to get away from this house, this place of death and darkness. I turned and ran, up the stairs, through the dark hallways, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I burst out the front door into the cool night air, gasping for breath. The house stood behind me, dark and silent, the shadows retreating. I stumbled to the truck, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold them. I climbed in, started the engine, and tore down the driveway, the tires kicking up gravel. The house faded into the darkness behind me, swallowed by the night. As I drove, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. The stranger had sacrificed himself to close the doorway, to stop whatever dark force the cult had tried to unleash. He had given his life to save mine. I didn't know if the danger was truly over, if the sacrifice had been enough. I didn't know if they would come after me, if the darkness would find me again. But as I sped down the empty road, the wind rushing through the open window, I knew one thing. I had survived. I was alive. But at what cost? The echo of the man's scream, the sight of the stranger consumed by flames, would haunt me for the rest of my days. And as I drove into the uncertain dawn, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The McAllister house stood alone in the darkness, but its presence lingered, a shadow over my soul, a reminder of the price of survival. And as the first light of morning broke over the horizon, I whispered a silent prayer.